Hello and welcome to a brand new avatar of Foreign Pulse. Until now, I've been bringing to you analysis, cutting edge thinking about international issues in Hindi. From this week, we are launching or relaunching ourselves in English in order to reach out to a broader audience across India and in the rest of the world. There is a lot of curiosity about what India and prominent Indian thinkers and intellectuals in the field of international issues think about what's happening around the world. And we want to energize that community and to convey a strong message through this show that India has a mind and is constantly evolving its position on various global issues and how they impact on our own country and on our consciousness and our conduct in the world. So like every week, we will have three major developments covered in this show. We will be looking first at the Middle East in Syria, where there are unfortunate allegations of fresh use of chemical weapons and the retaliatory steps that will follow involving military strikes by United States and Israel and possibly France. And we will look at the whole complex web of politics around this chemical weapons problem. Second, we will shift gears and go to Europe and study a small country but which has a giant impact, Hungary, where elections have recently been held and where right-wing populism continues to surge and is challenging the very core and the foundations of the European Union. And last but not least, we will go to Brazil, where a former president and an icon of the left has bit the dust and has been sentenced to jail. And this comes in the backdrop of a serious crisis of democracy in Brazil and brings to question whether Latin America can cope with this kind of major downfall in politics. So today, to discuss all these three issues, I'm very pleased to have with me my colleague Professor Kalyani Unkule. She is Director of International Affairs at the Jindal Global University. Thank you, Kalyani, for joining us. Let me then kickstart the show now. Syria is a tragedy that seems to never end, and the latest twist is allegations by the United States and some Western European countries against the government of Syria for using chemical weapons for the umpteenth time. This is not new. These allegations have existed since 2012, and there is proof of several sides, not just the Syrian state, resorting to some form of chemical warfare or the other over the years. Let's listen into this report and then discuss this problem.
On April 7th, more than 70 people were killed in Douma, a suburb of Damascus, in an alleged chemical attack by the Syrian government, which is fighting to root out anti-regime rebels. Repeated occurrences of chemical weapons usage in the Syrian war have reduced the international community just to a mute spectator. Western powers blame Russia and Iran for the tragedies, while the latter blame anti-regime jihadist rebels who are armed and financed by Western allies like Saudi Arabia and Turkey. Is the Western response of missile strikes on Syrian government military bases the correct way to deter chemical war? Can there be any relief for victims of weapons of mass destruction as long as the war goes on?
Can there be any justice? This is the big question I want to put out for you. The usage of these weapons are prohibited in international law, and yet they seem to be happening quite frequently. As to who is the perpetrator and who is the victim, I mean, there's a lot of confusion in the fog of war that's going on there. For example, so far no international observers have been able to reach the spot in Douma where the latest allegation has surfaced of the Syrian state allegedly using chemical weapons. But the point is, if these atrocities continue like this, it's been a war full of atrocities with hardly any respite for civilians on any side. Then we are left with a situation where completely, as I've mentioned in earlier shows also, international institutions, international order, international law, all of these seem to have failed. So it's a very critical juncture for us where there is no political solution. We still have these two camps, as our reporter was saying. Russia, Iran, Syrian government seem to be firmly rooted on one side, and Turkey may be moving in the direction. but Saudi Arabia, Israel, France, and the United States are in the other camp, and this has been the big geopolitical tussle that has in many ways devastated Syria and neighboring regions. So Kalyani, this is really reaching to new depths, and the question is what can be done about it. Whether these are chemical or not itself remains to be proved, but even otherwise, just the level of the devastation in Syria is simply it's a disgrace and a black mark on the international community.
That's right, Sriram. I think we need to look at events that have taken place all of last week before these allegations broke throughout the weekend. So we see in the first place that American President Donald Trump made the announcement that the US was ready for complete withdrawal from Syria. At the same time as the heads of state and government from Iran, Russia and Turkey were meeting in Ankara to discuss their coordination of their strategy in Syria. Now, on the other hand, if you see the reports that have been coming out in the media about this alleged, and I use the word alleged, about this alleged chemical attack, we see that even the Western networks which have been reporting the story have been careful to distance themselves from the authenticity of the footage that they are presenting. So if you put two and two together, the first question is, as you rightly point out, has there been a chemical attack? Now, it seems to me that the Assad government has very little incentive in the current state of affairs to
Kalyani,
draw.
As you say, the timing is suspicious, and it's quite clear that when Trump said he wants to withdraw, it seems like this is a ploy to ensure the continuity of US forces on the ground. And remember, the only one big global figure who was pleading to Trump not to withdraw was Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So they were saying, no way, you should not leave because we need your presence there in order to counter Iran. And then Trump, of course, in his characteristic way said, okay, we can stay if you pay for it. But the point is, there seemed to be some kind of a conspiracy behind this whole chemical weapons allegations, and in the past too, these are very disputed. But moving on, the bigger political question, Kalyani, you raised, why can't Turkey, Syria and Iran and the Russians, who now seem to be on one side, why can't they also involve the Americans and the Europeans and come to some kind of a complete cessation of hostilities, which has not happened? I mean, why can't we move away from the geopolitical mode of thinking and think in terms of humanity at all? Because after all, humanity is suffering in Syria, and this is really the big question, power versus morality, and it seems like morality has been losing continuously.
Well, I think we're a long way from seeing American and Russian collaboration in Syria. If you look at Nikki Haley's remarks at the UN General Assembly just yesterday, she was directly, attacking Russia for its role in supporting Assad. Also, I mean, when people talk about, is there a Cold War situation going on between or just round the corner between the US and Russia, I feel that they're forgetting the fact that there has been a proxy war in Syria of the kinds that we have seen in the Cold War era for the past 3 or 4 years playing out. Yeah. And I think the American response too is largely going to be informed by whether the Western allies, France and the UK in particular, support America in its bid.
Well, Macron is taking a very hard line on this, and as you know, Macron, the French president, has said he will go for unilateral strikes the next time there is a chemical attack, and so they are saying that now he's coordinating closely with the US. So it's a very worrisome situation because the retaliatory attacks do not end the problem, and they seem to actually exacerbate the problem. Let's hope for some kind of resolution to this. But frankly, we in India, we are watching, we want a political settlement and a political solution. We don't want this war to drag on endlessly and to keep on seeing these, dazed victims with their eyes glazed and with their mouths foaming. Whether this is an act or whether these are actually people suffering on the ground, the point is Syria has already taken a lot and we cannot allow this any further. The human conscience should awaken. There must be a political solution, not technical things like investigations and so on may be helpful, but ultimately the big players have to put their act together. Let's move on from Syria and go to Hungary, where Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister, has pulled out another rabbit from his hat, which is a massive electoral victory and a further challenge to the core institutions of the European Union. The right-wing populist, that self-described nemesis of the European Union, is on the rampage. Let's listen to this.
On April 8th, Hungary's ruling Fidesz's party won a landslide 2/3 majority victory in parliamentary elections and retained power. The populist and the anti-liberal Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who first took office in 2010, will continue to be in power for another 4 years. This is a big blow to the European Union, which Orban opposes vehemently, and another victory for the right-wing populism. The populist wave, which is based on anti-immigrant and anti-EU feelings, has overturned the liberal political system of the West and brought back the ghost of nationalism and dictatorship. Why are populists like Orban so successful with voters? Will the EU survive the populist onslaught or crumble?
Why are populists so popular? हिंदी में हम इसे कहते हैं लोकलुभावनवाद या जनरंजकवाद. तो ये इतनी बड़ी लहर कैसे फैली हुई है, एंड व्हाई इज इट दैट दे आर सो ascendant? ऐसा लग रहा है कि लहर जैसा फैला हुआ. एंड साथ साथ इफ यू सी go back to the roots of Viktor Orban and his success, it's not only anti-immigrant, it's not only Islamophobia, it's not only mocking the European Union and the Brussels dictatorship or the Brussels bureaucracy as he calls it. It's also a very clear agenda to hang on to power at all costs, and for that, of course, he has economic performance to boast of, and I will mention that it's called Orbanomics, that has worked somewhat. And there is, of course, the racism, which is intense actually in Central and Eastern Europe more than in the Western part. These are formerly Soviet spaces where the Soviet Union used to dominate, and they have never really gotten used to the idea of multiculturalism and these liberal values which they think are being imposed from outside by the EU. And remember, there is also this democratic deficit in this region, historically speaking. They have had strongmen rule over for a long time, and Orban fits the bill. Right now, he has gagged the media, he controls the courts, he has controlled the education system now, taken the parties, dominating almost all levers of society. They have used state funds and merged the party and the state almost into a single entity. So if you look at all this, the EU has been wanting to censure and stop Orban, but has failed so far. And it doesn't look like Orban is stepping back from the confrontation, because all the far right parties are jubilant around Europe, celebrating Orban's victory, because he's the original, long before Trump, long before Brexit, long before Poland or Austria or Czech Republic or even Germany, where far right has kind of surged recently. Long before all these, there was Viktor Orban, the first one who really, the horse that bolted and became clearly anti-liberal and anti-Western in that sense. So the EU, it looks like, Kalyani, that the EU is really split in the middle, and Orban is leading this charge, and I don't think the Europeans can really overcome this core division between the Western, especially France and Germany, that remain liberal, while Orban is going in the opposite direction.
That's right, Sriram. The anti-immigrant debate is back, and so is the debate over the future of the European Union. I don't quite think this is an isolated Eastern or Central European issue. There are a lot of anti-immigrant voices now emerging in Germany and France as well, countries who have long had a history of immigration. And let's not forget Brexit also, when Brexit took place, immigration was one of the major issues. One of the sort of factors that I think really is driving the right-wing resurgence is the aging of the population in Europe. As they say, it's strange if you're not a liberal under 30, and if it's very strange if you're a liberal after 40. So I think the aging of the population in Europe is also bringing up a scenario where older voters are concerned about the purity of the of the citizenship, of the state, of the population.
Yeah, and in fact, the base of Orban actually is older, and they also turn out a lot in elections. Unlike younger people who are disenchanted and disillusioned from politics, it seems the commitment to participation in voting is high. And 69%, Kalyani, 69% voted in this election, even though it was obvious that Orban is going to romp home once again. He won in 2010, won in 2014. You would think there is some anti-incumbency, some kind of withdrawal from politics, but no, 69% still turned up. And his rhetoric that the Africans are invading us, the Muslims will come and take over Christian civilization, all these, in a way, what used to be, as you said, the racial biases that were maybe in the dining hall indoors, he's brought them to the mainstream, and now they have become center stage.
That's right, Sriram. Hungarians have been inward looking for the past at least 5 or 6 years. We saw in 2013 when the refugee crisis broke out, they went so far as to actually construct fences, even though, as you know, they're part of the Schengen area. And really, this was the foundational principles of the European Union sort of coming apart at the seams.
Yeah, and as you say, there is also one more dimension here, which is the perceived domination of Germany. You see, the subtext to a lot of these, Orban has made, he has two bogeymen. One is Germany and Chancellor Angela Merkel, and the other is George Soros, who is of course the billionaire American philanthropist who is of Hungarian origin. And he has gone after these two entities and saying that these are the enemies of Hungary and of our nationalism and of our sovereignty. They're trying to, take control away from our own hands of our lives. And he has painted this demonic picture, and that they are, they're going to dump refugees on us, and they're forcing us to adopt quotas, and we will have nothing of that. And the whole criticism of the unelected European bureaucracy. That's the other big thing for Orban. Orban is saying, who votes for you? I mean, of course, there's a European Parliament, but even there, it looks like nationalist parties are going to dominate in the years to come, because the liberal integrationist side has become weaker and weaker, with Britain also pulling out. So it looks like this tussle between the nationalism and the EU integrationism is going to be a defining feature, and in many ways it will weaken the West in its ability to preach the liberal values to the rest of the world in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America.
That's right, Sriram. I mean, all of these tricks are straight from the playbook of right-wing populism. What really surprises me is only 10 years ago, all of these countries were contending to be part of the European Union, to be full members of the EU, and it has taken such a short time for that to come sort of full circle, and now, EU sort of being painted as the main threat to the national identity.
So I think this thing between cosmopolitanism and this rooted local nationalism or identity-based politics, I think that's going to get worse, and that's going to, as I said, be a defining feature. And in return, we, looking at it from outside, will be wondering what is the future of the liberal West itself if they are so divided internally. Okay, let's move on from Hungary and go to the next and the last story, which is of course very dramatic. Lula da Silva, one of the most popular politicians that Brazil has ever produced in the modern era, is in jail, and he is in the same jail which he himself inaugurated as president in 2007 in Curitiba. So, from icon of the masses to a convicted criminal, what a fall. And let's have a report on this and discuss the larger systemic ramifications of that.
On April 7th, Brazil's former president and leading contender for winning this year's election, Lula da Silva dramatically surrendered to the police and began serving a 12-year jail sentence for corruption. Lula is an icon of the left wing who is the most popular politician of Brazil in generations. His fall signals the entire political system in Brazil, be it left, right or center, has become highly unaccountable and corrupt. What is the alternative now for democracy to be sustained in Brazil? What can stop this emerging leader of Latin America from going further downhill?
The debate about Lula's imprisonment is, I would like to phrase it this way. Some who are in favor of it say that this is finally the rule of law has caught up with one of the political giants of the country, and this is equality before law, and even the former presidents will have to pay for their sins. But on the other hand, the Lula sympathizers and those on the left who say that this is a deliberate attempt by some kind of a deep state, which includes, they say, prosecutors and overzealous judges who are out to get them in order to undermine their chances of coming back to power in the coming elections, and that this is some kind of a soft coup that is going on. That's how Lula himself has projected it. He is saying that this is an elite that is unelected, and in some ways similar to Viktor Orban's criticism, because remember, Lula is a left-wing populist, just as Orban in Hungary is a right-wing populist, and all of them blame elites, and that's their number one target. And they say that, you know, this is a selective justice and there are so many others who are corrupt, but they are making an example out of our man Lula, who of course had a stellar record when he was in government. But now it turns out, we know that he had also been corrupt and had been involved in deal making where construction companies and state-owned oil companies were circulating kickbacks, massive kickbacks going into billions of dollars. So like in the Syrian story which we took up at the beginning, there are no saints here at all, and across the left, right and center there are many corrupt politicians. The president of Brazil himself, who has the lowest approval rating in history of 3%, Michel Temer, is just serving out time before the elections. Himself has been shielded by his party in the legislature to prevent him from going to jail and from being impeached. So if you look at it, if you're an ordinary Brazilian, you're looking at it and you're saying they're all rascals. But of course, Lula is popular, and that is a real story. That's the fascinating story. He's like, he seems to be like a, you know, like a Robin Hood figure, where he had redistributed wealth from the rich to the poor, reduced inequalities in Brazil, and created hope for a lot of people. But now, in hindsight, we realize that while he was doing all those social emancipatory things when he was the president the previous decade ago, there was also massive embezzlement going on in the name of the Socialist Party and its growth and all that. So Kalyani, no saints in this story, and it looks like Lula, is Lula really a victim, or is this just a kind of ex post self-justification that he is doing in order to keep the spirits of the left high?
Sriram, this story really proves the adage that truth is stranger than fiction. I mean, this is just irony on top of irony on top of irony. Lula is now in jail for proceedings known as the car wash investigation, which were initiated by his protege, Dilma Rousseff, while she was president. Certain highly placed political figures came under investigation, and they hit back, which cost her presidency after she was impeached last year. And now, as you just mentioned, the president is Temer, who belongs to a party whose sole raison d'etre in the Brazilian political landscape has been to play kingmaker and get kickbacks for supporting the party that is in government.
तो विकल्प देखिए क्या है, विकल्प क्या है इसमें? अगर लेफ्ट भी भ्रष्ट हैं और राइट भी भ्रष्ट हैं, और कोई सेंटर का कोई जैसा कोई किरदार है ही नहीं ब्राजीलियन पॉलिटिक्स में, क्योंकि आइडियोलॉजी के विचारधारा पर ये बंटे हुए हैं, तो लोगों से तो एक नई शक्ति उभरनी चाहिए, एक सिविल सोसाइटी, क्योंकि एक ज़माने में लूला खुद, ही हिमसेल्फ वाज अ पार्ट ऑफ दिस civil society and trade unions, and he had braved military dictatorship, and most of his associates went to jail and suffered torture, like Dilma Rousseff. He's the former president who was his associate. And now you find that the former oppressed can also become greedy and acquisitive and unaccountable, and that is the real tragedy of Brazil, because these were heroes, and like Chavez in Venezuela, Lula was like a big figure who was seen to be emancipating the Latin America and showing the new 21st century socialism, as he called it. But it looks like the socialists, for all their rhetoric of transforming the system, have themselves become part of this highly corrupt and unaccountable system. I just want to share an interesting stat with viewers. Brazil is not the most corrupt country in Latin America. There are some which are considered to be even more corrupt. For example, Mexico. For example, Venezuela. For example, Ecuador. For example, Bolivia. Just to name a few. But the reason Brazil is in turmoil is because it's a very unique factor where, as I said before, judges like Sergio Moro, the one who's gone after Lula to prosecute and imprison him, prosecutors, a lot of the law enforcement agencies have taken up cudgels against the politicians, and the politicians believe that the law enforcement is actually exceeding its limits and is undermining democracy itself. But the question is, can convicted criminals like Lula continue to rule? And if he were allowed to contest the elections, which now of course he is not, but suppose he was, he would again become president of Brazil. He is leading the opinion polls. So imagine a situation where the majority of people want Lula back and may even forgive him for his misdeeds. So clearly something is not right in terms of the institutions, in terms of the public opinion, in terms of the alternatives, in terms of civil society mobilization. Brazil at one point, when it overthrew military dictatorship, had a very, very robust civil society, but it's now been largely captured by these mainstream political parties. So they're really struggling to come up with alternatives. So Kalyani, what light can come at the end of this tunnel when Brazil is actually factually not as corrupt as some other countries, but because of this internal tussle within the state agencies, it looks like the skeletons are coming out of the board one by one, and we may see a lot more icons fall like this.
All we can say for sure right now, Sriram, is that things are going to get a lot worse in Brazil before they get better. The real change needs to also happen on the economic front, because remember, the big trigger for all of this corruption scandal to break out was the discovery of crude oil reserves in Brazil, which led to what is known as the resource curse, which prompts both high-level corruptions and also populist policies to distract from that corruption among the political circles. So I think that the more integrated Brazil is in the international economy, and the more it moves away from dependence on a natural resource-based economy,
let's hope, indeed.
The better things will get.
Absolutely. Those are good suggestions, Kalyani. I just want to remind viewers that Lula is not the only such figure. Last week, the former president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, was sentenced to 24 years in prison for pretty much similar misdemeanor, which is corruption and bribery and extortion from corporate houses. Jacob Zuma of South Africa, we have discussed before in this show, is also facing major prosecution for corruption. Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel is also likely to be taken to the court in the months to come for his own alleged embezzlement and kickbacks. So if you look at the whole thing, the culture of graft, it seems like, I don't know if we can generalize for the whole world, but many major developing and emerging economies are embroiled in them. And that's not good news, because we want to create a multipolar world. Thankfully in India, it's not looking as bad, because if you look at Transparency International rankings, India is 81st along with China, while Brazil is already gone into the 90s, and it seems to be getting worse. Plus the wealth inequalities are also much higher, as Kalyani was saying. There's also an economic problem in Brazil. So I think taken all together, a lot of reform is needed, a lot of people's movements are needed, and a lot of change is needed. I hope that you'll think about these issues. Even though we are somewhat removed from Brazil, we are part of BRICS, and the fate of Brazil will impact upon us, our ability to collectively change it to a multipolar world order. तो देखते रहिए फॉरेन पल्स हमारे साथ हर हफ्ते. थैंक यू फॉर जॉइनिंग अस. थैंक यू कल्याणी फॉर बीइंग माय गेस्ट टुडे. Thank you all